the Honorable Vice Dean of Academic and Student Affairs of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University, Dr. Maskun SHLM, the Honorable Guest Speaker, Professor of Intellectual Property Law from the School of Law, University of Nottingham, United Kingdom, Professor Dr. Paul L.C. Torremans. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the guest lecture webinar, The TRIPS Waiver for the Vaccine Patents. It held by the Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University as a development program for the key performance indicator achievements of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University 2022. My name is Normiati and I will be your master ceremony of today's guest lecture. The first agenda is the opening remark delivered by the representative of the Dean of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University, the Vice Dean of Academic and Student Affairs of Law Faculty, Dr. Maskun SHLM. To Dr. Maskun, time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Nomi, and then Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and then good morning in Nottingham, and then good afternoon. We are in Makassar in Indonesia. Alhamdulillah Alamin is an expression that will not be forgotten, to remain grateful and continue to be grateful to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for His mercy and grace. Let me welcome Professor Dr. Paul L.C. Torremans to the Red Campus. That's what we call for our campus in Hasanuddin University, in the Faculty of Law, Hasanuddin University, and then also our big thanks to the professor who has the opportunity to give guest lectures with the entitled The TRIPS Waiver for the Vaccine Patents. Of course, this topic is a very interesting topic to be discussed in the context of how to contextualize the idea of TRIPS for the sake of the vaccine patents. As we already know that most countries actually in terms of the COVID mostly we try to do our best to deal with the COVID, and then one of the solution that we create is in terms of creating the vaccine for the COVID. And then we hope that this guest lecture is the beginning, of course, of collaboration that can be carried out by the two law faculty in order to develop a network between university. In this context, indeed, the Faculty of Law Hasanuddin University is very welcoming if after the guest lecture, of course, it can be followed by, or it can be followed with some exploring cooperation and in academic and then research. And then by saying Bismillah, I officially open today public lectures. Thank you very much, and I return to the MC. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dr. Maskun SHLM, for the opening remark and for officially open this guest lecture. Now we will proceed to our main agenda, the lecture and discussion session that will be guided by our moderator, Ms. Nilasari SH. She is the alumni of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University and as well as the master's candidate from the School of Law of the University of Nottingham. Without further ado, I pass the floor to Ms. Nilasari SH.
Well, thank you, Master of Ceremony, for such a great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone in Indonesia, especially in Makassar. Good morning, Professor Paul, and welcome all the participants to the guest lecture conducted by the Faculty of Law, Hasanuddin University. So it's such a pleasure for me to be here after a while. So yeah, even it's online, but it feels like going back home. So I'm so pleased and humbled to be here to moderate this lecture and this event. First, I would like to thank the Faculty of Law, Hasanuddin University, especially the Vice Dean, Bapak Dr. Maskun SHLM, for setting up this event, for giving me the opportunity to come in this lecture. I'm so happy to meet you all. And so everyone, today's here with us Professor Paul Torremans. He's a professor of intellectual property law in the University of Nottingham. So Professor Paul Torremans, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Great. Professor, thank you very much for being here despite your packed schedule. Thank you for taking your time to come and to share knowledge with us here today, Professor. Thank you very much. So everyone, I think that we will discuss a very recent and ongoing issue relating to IP in the times of pandemic. It's very interesting topic, as Bapak Dr. Maskun said before, that it's very interesting topic because as we know that in this time of pandemic, there has been raising several legal issues, including IP, intellectual property law. So some said that IP has also contributed to the inequality of vaccine distribution. So that's why several countries has proposed a TRIPS waiver proposal, and then they claim that IP should be waived to scale up the vaccine production. And however, some said, opponents said that there has nothing to do with IP. The waiver, such waiver will also, hinder or even will be a threat to innovation. So that's why in this lecture, we have Professor Paul Torremans here. We'll discuss and we'll explain further about what the TRIP actually is, why patents, and what the consequence might be resulting due to this waiver and something. But before that, before going further, let me briefly read his CV first. So Professor Dr. Paul L.C. Torremans is a professor of intellectual property law in the University of Nottingham, and he's also a co-director of Commercial Law Center in the University of Nottingham. He was also a lecturer in several universities, as like Universities Leicester and also University of Leeds. And Professor Paul Torremans has been also an author of several outstanding books. So, and oh yeah, I have one of his books here. So what I'm holding right now is one of his outstanding books. It's 9th edition, by the way. It's like a compulsory book for us here studying law, especially who's taking intellectual property law. And besides that, Professor Paul also has many. So for your information, everyone, so here in his CV, Professor Paul wrote the title of his publications, and the total pages of his publication, it's only the titles, it's around 15 pages. So you can imagine how many his publication, the number of his publications. So it's very amazing. And one of the most interesting things also from Professor Torremans is he's really passionate in education and also in teaching. He loves teaching, he loves university, as he said, as he told me. So he has delivered many guest lectures in several universities around the world, and he also has conducted several joint research with institutions across the globe. And he also has collaborated with several universities around the world, like Shanghai University and University of Indonesia. So it's such a pleasure occasion for Unhas, Hasanuddin University, to collaborate with you, Professor. So without further ado, Professor Paul Torremans, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, whilst I try to find the slides, which we should have, now one is hiding the other. There we go. That should be better. Of course, thank you for the very nice introduction. Can I say, it's still early morning, but maybe we start with a joke. The fact that there are many publications also shows that I'm getting older. You know, just my little daughter likes to do that. She likes to say to any child that passes by that is about twice as old as she is. She's about almost 2 years. She looks at 4 or 5-year-olds and she says, baby. You know, I am the big one. I think in my case, she would say, daddy is old and therefore he has many publications. Anyway, without further ado and without trying to do a comedy show, which I'm really bad at, let's talk about the TRIPS waiver for vaccine patents. If you want to talk about the TRIPS waiver for vaccine patents, I think one has to start with the idea that why do we have patents? You know, what is this thing? Because the reality is that most vaccines, let's put them in the category of pharmaceutical products, they are researched, they are developed by private companies. Now, private companies, whether one likes it or not, they need to make money. You know, they have an investment from their shareholders. They need to pay their salaries. They need to have a return on that investment. The shareholders want some kind of return. I think that's an important element to keep in mind. This is private research, and therefore there is a corporate logic. Now, in that corporate logic, the reality is that you need to decide whether you are going to invest. I mean, I give you an example. I mean, company that they have rather close, about 5 kilometers away from where I was born and where I grew up. They are well known for vaccines. They have a massive vaccine division. They invested heavily in COVID vaccines. Now, their vaccine works. It's been approved, but it is not as effective as Pfizer, Moderna, and some of these smaller vaccines in the same category. So in other words, in terms of investment, you take a risk. And in Johnson & Johnson's case, I mean, I'm not saying they made a loss. I'm simply saying they invested a lot. Their vaccine works. It could not have worked. It could have failed, but it worked. But they did not get the return they wanted. So in that kind of market where you never know when you will succeed and how well you will succeed, the reality is then if it becomes a lot cheaper for other companies to wait and reverse engineer, to, as it were, take the product and then make a copy, slightly different copy or whatever, but if that is more cost effective, then the reality is that people will not invest. So if we want these vaccines, if we want pharmaceutical products, this is a risk that we have to avoid. We have to do something to avoid that people don't invest and therefore that we simply don't get these products. It's one thing to say we should distribute them better. It's one thing to say they should be produced under different conditions. We need to get them first. They need to be developed first. So there is a serious risk of market failure, particularly in the development of pharmaceuticals, since there's massive risks of not succeeding and there is a massive cost to these developments. I think in that context, it's rather important. In my view, it's absolutely vital to understand that competition just doesn't happen in the market. It happens at least at 3 levels in the market, or if you want, there are 3 different markets, right? There is the innovation level where you have competition. There is the production level where you have competition, and there is the consumption level where we have competition. Now, in order to understand how the mechanics of this work, it's probably easier to start from the bottom. It's the kind of thing that you and I may like. If there would be perfect competition, that's already the giveaway. There is no perfect competition. But if there were to be perfect competition at the consumption level, it would mean that you and I could consume as much as we like, whatever we like, without any cost. Because if there is a cost, then there is a limit. You know, you have limited resources, you only have that much money. So the assumption is perfect competition means we can consume, everything is in plentiful supply, we can consume without a cost. You and I know that that is not true. You and I know that that doesn't happen. Why does it not happen? Well, because if that were to happen, there would hardly be any competition at the production level. I mean, let's be honest. If you and I can consume free of charge, if we made something, if we produced something, someone else could take it for free and consume it and take it. It's much more in that kind of situation. What you do is you wait for someone else to be silly enough to produce, and then you consume. You and I know that that's not the reality. The simple reason for that is, amongst lawyers, this is kicking in an open door. We know the property rights. Now, we have installed the system. Someone owns certain things. You have a property title in certain things. Now, that means if you produce something, it's your property. Other people cannot simply take it. They have to acquire that title from you. Now, you can give the title for free, but you can also charge for it. And on that basis, you get competition at the production level because people think they can make money. They can do business. They can acquire other things if they sell their production. But of course, that means that you have, at the same time, a restriction of competition at the consumption level. You and I only have that much money, and we can only spend that much money. We have to make choices. So there is a restriction on competition at the consumption level, in furtherance of competition at the production level. Now, the kind of reality that we also face is that between the 2 other levels, production and innovation, you have the same reality. If there is absolutely no restriction at production level, I mean, the idea, it's not even a waiver, right? The idea is that there is no intellectual property right. You don't have to waive it, it doesn't exist. Everyone is free to produce. Whatever there is, you can copy, you can make. It doesn't even, well, the word copy already seems to suggest that it's not yours. You take something. In reality, then, is there is no right, so you can make whatever you like. Well, that means that very few people will be investing in innovation. I mean, I have to be careful what I say because we are amongst academics. But it would be silly university professors who innovate because they like it. But in a private company, why would you innovate? Why would you spend money on innovation if then everyone else can simply borrow the result of your work and make it? Because the reality then is that your costs are going to be higher. I mean, you have invested in developing the product, so therefore you have to recoup that investment. Well, you're going to be priced out of the market. In the worst scenario, you're going to go out of business, and the people copying will thrive. They will be successful. So what we therefore have installed is the same kind of idea as between production and consumption. We have installed what we call an intellectual property right. It's a property style right for immaterial goods, for patentable inventions in this case. And therefore what you get your permission. They need a license from you. During those 20 years, you're still competing with other products in the market. I mean, you're not a pure monopolist. There may be competing products of a different standard, slightly better, slightly worse, whatever. But I mean, there is competition, but not with an exact copy. And in that situation, you can try and charge a slightly higher price so that you can recoup your investment in research and development, and slightly more than recoup your investment. Because let's go back to the very first point I made. The idea is that people invest. Companies invest in developing new products. Well, if they invest, they have to pay their shareholders. So there has to be some kind of an idea that there might be a prize. There might be some kind of benefit. And that is the kind of thing that you do with intellectual property, with putting patents in place. So patents, they're there, not as a monopoly, but I would say they should be there as a restriction on competition at the production level, in furtherance, to enhance competition at the innovation level. And I think if you look at it that way, you get a slightly different picture in patent law. Now, look, I am not saying patent law is perfect, right? I'm not saying we get it all right in all cases. But at least the underlying idea is that why do we have requirements for patentability? Why do we talk about novelty? Well, if you have no novelty, there can be no market failure. I mean, if you have no new product, if you're simply copying, that's what the market is good at. You know, people do the same thing, they compete. And if you are the one that is of low quality, that is too expensive to produce and so forth, you may lose the business. Okay, but that's the market and that works well. So the first idea, the first stepping stone towards an idea that we need an exclusive right to stop the risk of market failure. Why do we need to enhance? Well, because we like innovation. Absence of novelty means there is no innovation. So, you know, the patents are unsuitable for that. So that's the first important requirement. And therefore one that we should in patent law adhere to rather strictly. Because if you take that away, or if you're being too flexible on that, the whole system becomes abusive. You grant exclusive rights and you get nothing in return. Well, that's not the aim of the game. We assume that a free market economy is the one that works best and is what we aspire to. And then, of course, you have the inventive step requirement. Even if it is new. I mean, my students have heard this example many times, but let me use the same thing again. Overhead projectors. We have them in all our lecture theaters in universities. Well, it might be perfect. I assume it is perfectly new to produce the same overhead projector, but to make the casing in fluorescent pink or yellow. I don't think that has been done. I haven't seen that. Should we give a patent? Should we give 20 years of exclusivity on the basis that it is new? Well, no, we shouldn't. Because the reason for that is that it won't work. The market will tell you that no one will buy these things. Because the idea is that you look at what is being projected. I mean, I try to make you look at what is on my slide rather than at the device that is projecting it. So the idea that it is white, black, beige, or some other kind of dull color, well, that is on purpose. You know, the idea is to not to focus attention there. So therefore, if you want an exclusive right, if we need something to avoid a market failure, there has to be quality as well. There has to be a departure from existing technology. That's the kind of innovation thing. innovation is more than just different, new. So what we try to protect is that. So therefore already, what I will return to later on, but let me highlight it here already, if we are doing patents for things like vaccine, we should apply these criteria strictly. I mean, there is no point in patenting, granting 20 years of exclusivity for an obvious small further development. You know, it needs to meet these requirements. And on that basis, I think my conclusion on the first slide, it's on the second line from the bottom, yeah, patents enhance vaccine development. Yeah, if you had said to Pfizer, to Moderna, well, let's take the typical example. Pfizer is an established company, right? I don't want to guess how much money they have in the bank and they could have spent anyway if they wanted to, right? But they have to justify it to their shareholders. But a new company like Moderna, if you said to them, there's not going to be a patent, they would simply not have been able to attract the investment, to get the money to develop the product. Maybe I give you another example outside vaccines. I mean, I have worked as a lawyer on the morality clause in patent law for embryonic stem cell inventions a number of years ago. Well, part of the experts that we worked with was a former professor of Oxford University who has now his own startup company, and they are developing a remedy for strokes. People who normally, after a stroke, live, it's a bit rude to say, but live as a plant, lie there, can't speak anymore, can't move anymore. Well, with that kind of technology that is currently in the final phase of clinical tests, they would be able to restore a decent condition of life to many of these patients. They would be able to, as it were, make, on the basis of a stem cell product, make these patients' own body regrow the damaged part of the brain. Now, the idea is that you replace yourself and the rest shrinks away. Now, that kind of company, I mean, my project is what, 10, 15 years ago, right? Well, for these, and they started a few years earlier, so for about 20 years now, this is a company that has been losing money. It's a spin-off company that tries to do little things, but every year they lose money. Well, how do you get people to invest in that company? Because there is a potential. What is that potential backed up with? Well, the idea that there may be a patent. In embryonic stem cells, by the way, this is going to be very, very difficult and very problematic. That's another matter. But, you know, it's that kind of idea. So on that basis, if we are doing this as private research, we may need patents in this case, you know, one way or another. Now, let's then have a look on the next slide. Well, how does this reflect this is, if you want, the almost, I should not say philosophical, but, you know, the kind of structural underpin, the economic underpinning of the thing. Well, the TRIPS agreement then says in Article 27, I mean, I think this is, if you want, in terms of a waiver, what are you going to waive? Well, you're going to waive this obligation, right? There's an obligation put in place in the TRIPS agreement by the WTO, by the World Trade Organization, on all its members. And that is that, subject to the provisions of what is going to follow, of course, patents shall be available for any inventions, products or processes. No distinction possible, and in all fields of technology. So let's be clear, a vaccine as a product, whether it is a pharmaceutical product or any other field of technology, you have to have a patent available. If they are new, involve an inventive step, and are capable of industrial application. I mean, here we are back to the requirements that I highlighted. They don't come out of the blue. They are not just plucked out of thin air. They are there because that is the way to stop the market failure and to make sure that you don't protect too many things, right? That's the idea. to just have the limited protection that is needed. And of course, you can have this without looking at place of invention, field of technology, whether it's imported or locally produced, right? I mean, that's the idea. Apart from that, if you meet these three criteria, you'll get your patent. There are no further restrictions. And then we come to paragraph 2. Paragraph 2, I'm afraid, is often misunderstood. It's the paragraph that have been referred to by many people and say, well, wait a second, we don't have to have patents for these things because members may exclude from patentability inventions, the prevention within their territory of the commercial exploitation of which is necessary to protect order public or morality. Now comes the important bit. That includes to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, or to avoid serious prejudice to the environment by their law. So the idea is we are protecting public health here. And therefore, we don't need to grant patents, let's say for pharmaceutical products, let's say for vaccines. Well, the honest answer is that's not what this provision says. This provision says that you can exclude an invention. So you cannot exclude a whole group. And paragraph 1 says all fields of technology. Paragraph 2 says individual inventions may be refused a patent. They may be refused a patent if the commercial exploitation. So you assume that we grant the patent. What is going to happen if we exploit this patent? There is going to be serious damage to health. So, just 1 second. Okay. So, the idea is take the patent, assume there is one, and then if you exploit, there is something going wrong. But you cannot do this by mere legal provision. So you cannot have a provision in your law saying no patent. No. You have to assume that on the basis of general morality in society, on the basis of the overall idea about how you protect human health, that this is objectionable. If you read further on in the TRIPS agreement, it says that this is open to judicial review. Patent, they go to court. And I mean, there are stories in African countries where then you see the corporate jets of the multinationals arrive with people with golden Rolex watches and the like, i.e. extremely well-paid lawyers who are going to argue that this is a false decision and that should be overturned. So paragraph 2, yes, it is there, but this is not your miracle solution in the same way that we are clearly also not under paragraph 3, diagnostic, therapeutic, surgical methods. That's not a vaccine, right? A vaccine is something else, right? So the reality is the obligation we are under is to grant a patent, right? At that level, let there be no doubt, we have to grant protection. Therefore, I come back to the thing, exclusive rights is the norm, right? The idea of this system is that if you have a vaccine, it comes under all these conditions. It is new, it's inventive. Take the Moderna, Pfizer vaccines to take an absolutely clear-cut case. This is new technology. The RNA technology is absolutely new. It's inventive. Therefore, you can get your patent. The reality then is that we are looking for voluntary licensing. I mean, people always talk about exclusivity and the exclusive right as if you have a patent, you have that monopoly, and there are tons of money coming in. I mean, that's not true either, right? So the exclusive right simply means you can stop others from making the vaccine. It still means that if you want to make money, and remember what I said at the beginning, the idea is to make money for your shareholders. That's how these private companies work. You need to exploit. So there is an assumption that you will try to satisfy the market, if you want, as much as possible. The idea is not, and we come back to that in terms of vaccines, right? But the idea is not that you try and exclude certain parts of the world. The idea is not that you say we cannot supply, we will not supply, because you're not making money then, right? You are trying to make money. So either you make this yourself, or you look for licensees. You look for other people, maybe in other parts of the world. If you are based, I mean, it's probably a bad example, but I mean, let's take Moderna as an example. It's a relatively new company. They don't have massive facilities necessarily. So they can either hire in facilities to make for them, subcontractors, or they can grant licenses in other parts of the world. Right? It's as simple as that. I have no idea. When I got my first vaccine, it was Moderna. And on the certificate, it says, I mean, it's an American company. It says made in Spain. Whether that is a company they have in Spain, a facility they have built in Spain, whether that is a facility they bought in Spain, whether that is a subcontractant who brings it out under their name. But I mean, the idea of voluntary licensing is part of the game. So I think one has to be a bit careful by saying you don't want to grant licenses. I think they want to grant license. Of course, the commercial conditions need to be right. If the license needs to be granted at such a low price that they don't make any money, yeah, they won't, right? They may prefer, as it were, to hire in production capacity and to do it under their own name rather than to grant licenses to any of their competitors. On the other, I mean, I'm not saying this is all perfect, right? But I'm simply highlighting that Johnson & Johnson, their vaccine is being used. It is workable. I mean, it does provide protection. Well, they have a licensing deal in South Africa. There's a South African company making it under license. Probably not the most successful license deal, looking at how the product positions itself in relation to other products. But that it is happening, right? I mean, it's just not true that these companies cannot, will not license. I mean, if the conditions are right, the market conditions are right, that is part of the scheme. There's also, maybe I should not have put that with the abbreviation, there's the University of Leuven in Belgium. They are developing on a purely academic basis a vaccine. So it goes a bit slower, right? But their vaccine is specifically developed for developing countries. Why do I say that? Because, look, if you look at Pfizer, Moderna to a slightly lesser extent, but I mean, Pfizer, it needs to be transported under extreme conditions. It needs to be very, very cold and dry ice is needed and so forth. When it is available, it needs to be used rather quickly. So in terms of use in remote parts of developing countries with a somewhat with a much higher temperature than what we have in Northern Europe, that is a problem. So here you have an academic vaccine that is being developed, and that will be licensed. The idea is that local partners will make this, keep the chains short, and make sure you have a product that can be transported easily. That's again based on voluntary licensing. But of course, the important point to note here is this is a different proposition altogether. This is a university producing a vaccine. Oh, yes, of course, if at all possible, they would like to have a return on their investment. right? If they invest money in it, they can invest it in further research, but it's not necessary, right? The money comes from public funds. The university is funded to do this kind of research, and therefore you get a very different basis. Now, of course, a long time earlier, right? In terms of speed, this is where you lose an effect because the funds available, the numbers of staff available are not the same, right? But it is something that is done. And by the way, this is not the first time they do it, right? There is already a product available in the HIV AIDS research, some kind of gel, which they developed, and which, by the way, they that went through Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson said, look, we don't think there is a commercial basis for us to do this on, i.e. It sounds a bit horrible, but that's what it is. I mean, we can't make enough profit in the developed world with this, but this is a product that may work well in other countries where, for example, treatment with expensive drugs is not yet available to all. Well, on that basis, we are happy to license other partners locally and to almost give the license away for free. As far as I understand, the only charge that they make is a minimum cost for the kind of technical assistance that they provide and the follow-up that they provide afterwards. If you want someone to do quality control, yeah, you pay that expense, but the license apart from that is for free. So these things exist, right? It's also, I think, important to think that the patent system has what I would call a stick behind the door. I mean, it's not true that you can say the market will tell you that you should license, you should exploit. And if you don't, well, yeah, that's your right. I mean, you have less money and so forth, right? I mean, there is this idea that not only is the technology published in a patent application, the idea is also that we are at least potentially seeing the product. And therefore, if that doesn't happen, you can have a compulsory license. So that is, I think, the mechanism that patent law envisages, saying if it doesn't happen, if people don't play the system correctly, then the authorities in the different countries may grant a compulsory license. That is what Article 31 of the TRIPS agreement is all about. Now, rest assured, I'm not going to take you through all of this small print, but I think I ought to show you Article 31. By the way, there is a second slide coming with the rest of Article 31. Just to say to you, it's, shall I call it, maybe not the stick behind the door, the emergency exit, maybe? The idea is really that normally people will exploit. So the idea is that we don't need this normally, right? This is for emergency situations. And therefore, that's a fair criticism of the WTO's patent system. Article 31 is extremely cumbersome. It doesn't make it easy. Once again, let me repeat it, 27, 31 together. 31 is not for whole categories of products. You cannot say for any pharmaceutical product, we do this, right? By the way, that's what Canada did before the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that is where all this comes from, right? The US and Canada entered into a free trade agreement. Part of the deal was that Canada would no longer issue what were not compulsory, but licenses of right. Automatically, you could apply as a generics company. I think it was after 3 years, could be 5 years, but I think it was 3 years. I think it was 3 years and the 5% royalty. I did research on this, but it's a long, long time ago, right? Well, that had to go. It had to be, in extreme cases, 1 by 1. Well, that's what you have here. And the argument is, normally, individual merits, 1 by 1. First of all, you should try and negotiate a normal license. Now, it's important after the whole Doha saga and others, that doesn't apply if it's about public health. So if you think about vaccine waivers and the like in these contexts, you don't necessarily have to try to negotiate first. You can cut that bit out. But I mean, license shall be non-exclusive. It's non-assignable. So you have to do it yourself. Predominantly your home market only. I mean, the real idea is that you can do this, but only to, I mean, what is the reality here? The idea is the product is not made available in your country. Then you can grant the license and someone can exploit it locally. Non-exclusive, because if the original product wants to come, the idea is that's still better, right? So you may use this as a stick to say to the original patent holder, maybe you want to come anyway, you want to put the product on the market yourself. And only for the domestic market. Well, the reality is, who are you going to find? I mean, it's one thing to say we're going to do this, but you have to find a volunteer, i.e. a company, to take this on. And it then says, if the abuse, the reason for it stops, the license stops. I mean, this is not the greatest of models, right? I mean, this is not a great system, because if I have to invest an awful lot in setting this up, I can't export almost. It's non-exclusive, so it means that anyone else can also take one. Well, there may not be many candidates. But if the original company comes and takes over and says, thank you, you've now broken open the market and, you know, we'll do this ourselves, and then my license disappears. I mean, that is you know, not the greatest of systems. Let us skip that kind of thing, right? I mean, this is not it's really emergency use anyway. Now, the waiver option, right? You may have started wondering, when on earth is he going to talk about the waiver? Well, I think it's important to get this background organized, because the waiver option is not in the TRIPS agreement. It shows you already how extreme this is, right? The idea is really this patent system will work. People will voluntarily exploit, and then there will be competition and so forth. If it doesn't work, there's 31, the stick behind the door. Clumsy as it is, and but we won't need this. We know, but well, we won't need this. The fact that it is there, the fact that you say to people, if you have a patent, you have to be a bit careful, right? If you start behaving irrationally, you may have a compulsory license issued. And by the way, I should say, I mean, this is again, it shows crisis, that compulsory licensing may be a way to make some of these expensive drugs available in developing countries. In one set of compulsory licenses. Because the idea is, of course, that's the other complication, right? If you want a compulsory license and you want it to be after Doha, you can have it made abroad, right? If you can't do it locally, you can import on that basis. Well, on that basis, you have 2 licenses, one in Canada to authorize a company to supply, one in Rwanda in Africa, because they needed it. And then the drugs came from Canada to Rwanda. It took years to negotiate, and the argument is that the price was still rather expensive, and the volumes that were, I mean, okay, I mean, well, no ambassador of Rwanda in the room, I hope, but you know, it's one of your islands, right? One of the smaller islands of Indonesia, and that's the country of Rwanda. But anyway, even then, the volumes seem to be rather small, and that was that. I think most, well, there's two parts of this reality, right? The argument is, to the one extent, all the others looked at it and said, if it's that complicated, it's not worth doing. I think the other part of that coin is that the fact that it happened. And if you think that I'm telling stories, keep it in mind. In my conclusion, I come back to this kind of analysis. It makes it difficult because you don't know whether they all said it's not worth doing. What you saw on the other side is that pharmaceutical companies started being more flexible. They started offering better deals. They started making their products, rather than risk a compulsory license, they started making their products available under better conditions. I mean, I used to know a doctor an Italian doctor who in his spare time ran every summer an HIV clinic in Mozambique in Africa. Before Doha, his argument was, I can invest my own money in going there and doing this in my holidays, and we can invest a bit in the equipment for the hospital. But buying these pharmaceutical products for all these patients, we just can't do. You know, we don't make enough money every year in Italy to do that. His argument was that after Doha, there were pharmaceutical companies queuing at his door saying, we want to give you a number of products. And if the government in Mozambique is happy, for a very low price, we can sell a bit, more. And there was a cut price deal available. So question is this, after Doha, the new 31 system that still doesn't work? Or is it the stick behind the door that works? And that, as it were, works as a carrot for the industry, saying, maybe you better solve this yourself. Maybe you better offer on a voluntary basis, with the patent in place and with your protection being intact, better conditions in developing countries where people simply can't pay the full price anyway. So either you make zero money, or maybe you make a little bit of money, and you provide the service, and of course you get all the good publicity, right? That's the kind of thing that has happened. Now, on top of all that, fully outside the TRIPS agreement, you get the waiver option. For those of you who are not necessarily full-time IP buffs, the TRIPS agreement comes as an annex to the Marrakesh agreement that founded the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So in a sense, you have the original WTO agreement establishing the WTO, and then you have one of the annexes, one of the specific agreements is the TRIPS agreement, intellectual property. Here, the reality is, if you read the TRIPS agreement, if I may say so, it stops at Article 31, or now after Doha, Article 31 bis, right? That's it, compulsory licensing. If you go back to the Marrakesh agreement itself, Article 9, paragraph 3 of the Marrakesh agreement says, we have a general clause. The general clause says that in exceptional circumstances, here we are already, right? In exceptional circumstances. What on earth are exceptional circumstances? How do you prove that? But anyway, the ministerial conference may decide to waive an obligation imposed on a member by this agreement or any of the multilateral trade agreements. So you can waive an obligation, provided that any such decision shall be taken by 3/4 of the members, unless otherwise provided for in this paragraph. So you need a very large majority. It tells you again, exceptional circumstances, and you then need 75% of the members to be in favor. It's not an easy process, right? You need to convince almost everyone around the table that you have exceptional circumstances. This is not your normal thing where we have new viruses appearing and little pandemics here and there appearing. And then you need this vast majority. And what do? You waive an obligation. So there is a political process leading to a political decision. This is not the kind of thing where a member state can say, this is a legal mechanism that I use. This is not a compulsory license that I can establish. This is a political decision saying this is exceptional. We didn't think about this. The provisions are not suited for this kind of situation. And therefore, we waive an obligation. So you waive the obligation, for example, to have patents and to make them enforceable, right? So you could, in Geneva, by an agreement, say vaccines for COVID-19, we waive the obligation to have patents. And that would mean that anyone could copy, right? I mean, that's the, well, that's again the political idea, right? And I will try and say, not from a legal point, but from a technical point of view, that that's simplistic, right? But I mean, the simplistic political idea is that there is no obligation anymore to grant patents. There is no obligation anymore. Maybe there's no obligation. Well, in practice, they would grant the patents, right? But the enforcement of the patent would be waived. And it would happen probably for a limited period of time. Not for no patent, maybe a patent, but for the first 5 years, 10 years, we waive the enforcement, the enforceability of the patent. And therefore, other players can make the vaccine. That's the idea, right? Now, why would you like to have such a waiver? Why would you like to say, we are in these exceptional circumstances? Well, basically, the argument is, we have a pandemic. The kind of pandemic that we've rarely seen. That means, typically, we need, what, 2 doses for everyone on the planet. Now, let me not try and guess how many we are on the planet. You know, newborn babies and the like maybe don't need this yet, but whatever. I mean, you need absolutely vast amounts of this. It's simply not possible for the existing patent holder to produce this. Even if Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, you know, if they all ramp up their production as much as possible, and we call upon our friends in China to do the same with their 2 vaccines whose names now escape me, we're still getting nowhere. We're still not producing in the short term the amount of vaccines that we need. So on that basis of a failure not because of bad faith, but of bad will, but because it's just not possible, we need to ramp up production. And of course, the argument is that it did not happen. I mean, it took too long to negotiate that South Africa deal for Johnson & Johnson. It just doesn't happen by means of fun. You see where the difficulty comes? Exceptional circumstances. The system says, okay, we have this need, but you also would need to prove that it doesn't happen on a voluntary basis. You would have to prove that it cannot happen by way of Article 31. Because otherwise it's not exceptional. Otherwise it's the non-exceptional circumstances that the TRIPS agreement can deal with. So the idea is that you allow countries with production facilities to help out. I mean, that at least was the argument, right? I mean, I heard plenty of that in previous months and years. That, you know, there was production facilities in countries like India. I'm not sure how much facilities you had in Indonesia, but I mean, in many countries, India was an example because they have very large producers, but there is capacity here. We can do this. Give us a license? No, waive it then, and then we can do this. We can do this. We can ramp up production. We have the facilities. We can even establish, that was the other argument, if this is going through, we can establish new facilities if you waive the patent, some commercial players will build new factories. That's already where you start thinking, well, how much wishful thinking is this? I don't think that a production plant for vaccines is something that you build in a couple of months. I mean, I see the Chinese built an emergency hospital with containers and the like in a few weeks and months, but a production facility for mRNA vaccines, fundamentally new technology that very few people know about, and now we're going to build this facility and get it up and running. I think that's already much more complicated. I also think, by the way, that the idea that there were endless facilities waiting to start, maybe that is also a bit of an exaggeration. I think it would have taken them a while to acquire the new technology and get that up and running. But I mean, there were facilities that could have been put to good use. And of course, there is in the background also this idea that it may reduce the price. Or at least there is the argument by those in favor of all this, that of course, why don't Pfizer, Moderna and the like don't enter into the license deal? Because they try to keep the price up, right? If they give too many licenses, the volume goes up, prices will come down. Again, I'm skeptical, right? I mean, the people who wanted to step in, who wanted to produce, were also commercial companies. They also need to invest. They need to retrain their staff. They need to get going and so forth. So price reduction, you know, we live in hope, but I'm not sure that that's the killer argument, that's the one thing. The kind of thing that I'm also asking myself, and that's of course, I mean, this is not me trying to say why not a waiver, right? But this is simply saying you need to prove these exceptional circumstances. These exceptional circumstances that where the problem is the patent. And therefore you need to waive that obligation. The only thing you can waive in this context as a WTO obligation is the idea of an enforceable patent. Well, in reality, there's been a lot of arguments that the whole problem was not necessarily production. The whole thing was distribution. In part, the Pfizer thing with their black ice and the like, wherever you produce that in the world, you would still have the same black ice problem in terms of distribution. The other thing was, well, we didn't quite manage, the WTO didn't quite manage to set up an effective distribution system. I mean, look, I mean, I put a big question mark there. COVAX failure question mark. Personally, I think it's a bit cheap and a too easy conclusion to say COVAX was a failure, right? I think COVAX was a good idea. COVAX was a good idea on the basis that it was supposed to be a system where there was a pool. Anyone who had goodwill, anyone who could, well, let me start from the beginning. The idea was that we have these commercial companies developing these vaccines. They come at a price. They need to be paid for. We need to reward these people. That's the patent system, and we need them in the future. We need them to stay in the patent and in the vaccine business and develop new vaccines for mutant versions of the COVID virus. We need them for new viruses. So how do we do this? Well, the richer countries will buy too much. They will, as it were, pay for this. And part of what they buy will go into this COVAX system. They will donate, they will make available a number of doses to that system. And the COVAX system will then distribute it to those countries that cannot afford to buy 2 doses of these vaccines for all members of their population. What COVAX became, and that I think that's a sensible idea. I mean, the WTO doesn't have the money to buy all these vaccines, so it's the member states who need to do that, and then put them together, pull them together, and we distribute them. What it became was, of course, a system where developed countries ordered massive volumes, stockpiled them for their own purposes, and the leftovers went to COVAX, or the ones that were going to expire relatively quickly. And then, of course, you have a system that doesn't work because they don't get the volumes that they need. And the volumes that they get often need to be very quickly distributed, and therefore they run out of time, or they cannot do it efficiently. They cannot plan. Now, again, let's not be too critical. I see in my close family, in certain countries in Asia, where really they don't have the money. I mean, well, since you're in Asia, maybe I should tell you, my wife comes from Laos. Well, the question is, how much can the government in Laos afford by way of buying vaccines? I think the argument is very little. In comparison, you, Thailand, and others are extremely rich in Asia, right? They really have a problem in Laos. Well, the reality is that they received, not always directly, sometimes directly, not, well, the argument then is it needed to go quick. So COVAX, too long, let's send directly. They received quite a bit. Relative numbers of the population at least got 1 doses. Many got 2. So in that sense, I don't think the whole COVAX thing could be said to be a failure. But what is true, and that is the bottom of my slide there, what didn't help was massive orders by developed countries blocking supplies. You know, the EU, United Kingdom being a massive offender, they didn't, until very late, they refused to export. Mr. Johnson refused to export any AstraZeneca because he needed it all for the United Kingdom. Well, on that basis, it cannot work, right? If you don't share, cannot work. It's only when they were moving on to Pfizer and they had surplus that it started to flow. The EU slightly better. Because the EU is still sitting on massive volumes. And of course, they ordered it meant that other countries could not place an order. The prices were high, and the argument was, you can be in the queue, and when we have supplied them 6 months from now, you may get something, right? I'm exaggerating, right? But I mean, so the question is, in how far is this a supply issue, a distribution thing, rather than anything else? Question, do we really need the waiver? Okay, let me move on to why should we not have a waiver? Well, I think one has to be, with a waiver, one has to be extremely careful. It is, whether one likes it or not, it is counterproductive in terms of innovation. If you say to companies, and not necessarily to the company, but these companies need to convince investors to give them money, to make funding available. Shareholders and others need to put funding available up front. Why are they doing it? Because there is a patent system. By the way, there is no guarantee that you will get a patent, right? The idea is that you can play the game, and if you meet the criteria, you may get your patent. If now on top of that risk that you may not meet the criteria and may not get a patent, you may not succeed. And even if you succeed, the market may not like your product, like Johnson & Johnson, you know, it's not as good as the others. So therefore, it's the others who run away with the biggest share of the market. If on top of all that, you're going to say to them, if it's really a pandemic, i.e. if there really is a need and you're all rushing to do things, it may be waived for 5 to 10 years, i.e. you may have 0 financial return. You may have to compete with people who can make it more cheaply because they didn't have the development cost. They didn't necessarily have all the clinical trial costs. There is a serious risk that you will stop investments in development of vaccines. And what's the point in trying to have more people produce it if some of the vaccines are not developed in the first place? So you need to be very careful. What that means is that you need to define extremely carefully what these exceptional circumstances are. If people start believing that whatever politicians think is needed, they will put it under exceptional. If people don't know how exceptional is, then this will become a deterrent for innovation. That's not what you want. Even if you overcome that hurdle, there's the trade secret hurdle. I mean, if I waive a patent, can I really make the vaccine? Is it like, it's not a recipe. It's not saying do this first, do that, you know, it's not as detailed. I mean, if you look at Moderna's policy, you get a clear example. Moderna has said right from the beginning, let people do reverse engineering. And if in the process of reverse engineering they copy, we will not sue. And that's the headline. And they make themselves popular with that. If you read what their boss says in the second line, he says, we have enough trade secrets, they won't be able to do it. I don't believe it. So in a sense, even if you waive the patent, they may not be able to make it because there's enough trade secrets. And of course, there is no waiver for trade secrets because there is no obligation on member states of the WTO to have a system for trade secrets. I mean, that is, so you know, you need to be very careful that you also provide a mechanism where the trade secrets are being shared and transferred. That's not obvious, right? It's not as simple as waive the patent and we're out of the woods. And then, of course, there's the argument, an argument that I think many in the industry, I mean, in the initial phases, all of these producers were complaining that there were hurdles in terms of limited availability of raw materials, that they could ramp up production even faster and more, but that they couldn't get hold of the raw materials, or that it took a while to get it on stream. Now, if we are going to say that there's going to be, what, 10, 15, 20 more people producing this, the same raw materials are going to be in even more demand. Are we absolutely convinced that we will be able to supply everyone in time? Or are we simply going to say, my factory will run this week and then I have to wait for a new supply. I will stop 1 week and then you may run another week. I mean, in that sense, we need a system, or we need guarantees that there is enough raw materials for everyone to share. The same kind of thing applies in terms of competent staff. I mean, it's simply an illusion to think that we have so many people around the world that can run all these factories with technology that is brand new. You know, all these facilities may be able to copy traditional drugs, but if you have a new technology like these mRNA vaccines, do you have the staff? Can you train them? Well, who's going to train them? The people who know. They're running the Pfizer, Moderna, and other facilities. They cannot spare these people, right? Even if it is to train others. So there again, there's going to be delays. If you need to add infrastructure, yeah, that takes time. So in that sense, I think the argument that the waiver is the miracle solution and that it will all work very quickly, I think that's a bit of an illusion. Having said that, eventually, we had a WTO waiver, right? There was this political decision in June of this year. Now, first question I ask, and I let you answer that, is that too late? I mean, really, I mean, I read yesterday, and I think I have absolutely no problem with sharing that idea and believing that. The Director General of the WHO saying this is far from over. Yeah, I know. But on the other hand, when did we need these vaccines most? When could we really have avoided several thousand deaths and people with serious consequences? Well, if we had them early on. Now it's nice to have them, and we still have a way to cover, and we still have booster doses to be administered and the like. But are we really going to see a massive effect now if there are 20 or 30 more people producing? We're going to see an effect, but not. Well, on the other hand, what you get is what looks like a 5-year deal. I say what looks like because it can be extended. Yeah, but for anyone making an investment, for anyone deciding to use this system, certainty is 5 years. Now, 5 years. How long does it take to get going? It's not 5 years of full production, right? It's only for developing WTO members. Now, I mean, there again, I mean, let me ask a hypothetical question. Where does Indonesia see itself? Where does Thailand see itself? Where does China see itself? I mean, there is no, in the deal, there is no definition of what is a developing member of the WTO. If you are on the side of the patent holders, this is where you get worried. There's no definition of exceptional circumstance. There is an idea that this is an exceptional circumstance. Yeah, but what is the definition for the future? When do we run the risk? Well, we don't know. Which developing member can do this? Where are you going to see these additional producers? i.e., where are you going to see this competition at lower cost? What is the risk, financial loss that you're going to suffer? Well, it's very hard to define because it's not there. And then this is where really you think this is politicians, right? This is a political compromise. Those with production facilities are expected to abstain from using it. So if you can produce, the idea is that you're going to have new facilities, or that someone is going to produce for someone else. But if you have the facilities yourself, you should abstain from it. Well, again, there is no definition. I mean, and you are expected. My understanding is that the reason it is expected, and it's not a full obligation, is that China didn't want a full obligation. Okay, well, China has rather a lot of capacity. They are producing massive volumes. Are they a developing WTO member? They like to think that certain parts of the country still need development, and I'm not disputing that. But I mean, China as a developing country, China as a developing member here, despite the fact that they have 2 of the largest vaccine productions? I don't know. I mean, again, lack of certainty. I come back to that point. How much time does it give for production? Why? Because the argument is, in the system, how are we going to do this? You're not going to have no patent. The patent will be granted. But we are going to use the mechanism of a compulsory license. A compulsory license are being waived. How do we do that? Compulsory license. Well, there's a process, there's a procedure. It takes time. Then you need regulatory approval. I mean, you don't hear me say that this is something we should cut out. Definitely, those who are going to make this should get approval in terms of health, safety, the fact that their production is up to scratch and up to standards. But I think the honest argument is that this is going to take 2 years, something of that order. Well, that means the 5-year deal becomes a 3-year deal. If you are going to invest in using the waiver, all you have is a guarantee that you can produce for 3 years. I mean, is that going to work? And then you are expected. There's an expectation that you will export more than 50% of your production. So the idea is that we're going to share. Of course, it makes it also possible for people to produce for others who don't have facilities. Yes. Argument here is, is that worth having? Is this really the kind of thing that we fought so long and hard for? Is this going to add something? And of course, a real waiver, sorry, that's not what it is, right? If you look at all these conditions and all these, I mean, it's not the kind of idea we waive patent protection for vaccines. That was the original idea. Well, no, we're only going to do it in developing members, only for a limited period of time. And there has to be a compulsory license. I mean, it's not exactly a perfect deal, right? It's a political deal. With that, I think my time is roughly up, so I come to my conclusion. If you want a conclusion in one line, I really don't know. I mean, you can make an argument that what you get is a little, it's not a full waiver, and that you get it a little late. The opportunity was 2.5 years ago. But there's a little there. We get something. It's not too bad. Or you can say it's too little and it's too late. It's gone. I really don't know. Well, time will tell. I come back to what I said earlier. Sometimes the fact that the mechanism is there and that it has been used produces goodwill, produces more voluntary licenses in our case. So maybe this is a precedent. Maybe we have for the first time used this waiver. And maybe, the door is now open. Maybe we can do better next time. And therefore, you say to member states, you say to the industry, you better avoid that. If you produce enough on the reasonable conditions, if you license enough foreign partners, we don't need a waiver next time. And of course, licenses means you can do it under your terms and conditions. And your terms and conditions means also an industry being worried about standards. I mean, look, if it's a Pfizer vaccine made by Joe Bloggs in Papua New Guinea, and people die because it's badly made, what are we going to read in the press? People die from Pfizer vaccine, right? So if you are Pfizer, you have a vast preference for running the show yourself, and the show then includes quality control. You are in charge. If there's a waiver, You can't enforce your patent. You're not in charge. Someone else is in charge. National authorities are in charge. How good are they in this emerging technology? How many people do they have for quality control, for example, that are fully trained in mRNA production? How many consultants can they hire that are fully aware of this and can do the job? So in that sense, the door is open. And maybe, therefore, the industry will try and avoid at all costs. Maybe there will be more willingness to license. Or, of course, on the other hand, we've shown that it's not working. I mean, 2.5 years later, and then you get this kind of monstrosity that has all kind of limitations and uncertainties in it. Maybe the argument is no one will ever invest the same political capital in it again. Member states and politicians will not try to do this again because they know that what they gain in the end is fairly minimal. And in a sense, what is the political gain? I mean, I looked at it to make sure I had all the information. Yesterday evening, I was surfing the internet to see whether there was anything else from the WTO. Well, if you look at what's on the web, there's very little. I.e., there was a lot of storm, and like we need 2.5 years ago, we need a waiver. Now that we have it, everyone seems to say, okay, it's in the past. It's done. Maybe the answer is, therefore, they won't try it again. So therefore, I come back to my conclusion. Time will tell. We don't know. Question is, I mean, I'm a firm believer in a patent system, but a patent system that is run properly. So I think compulsory licensing and waiver should be part of this. But if you ask me, are we now better prepared to deal with the next pandemic? I think my optimism is not overflowing, right? I think we are still in a kind of murky situation where things may or may not work. A lot will still depend on how people use the system, but there are no mechanisms to make them use the system. I don't think we are going far enough. Anyway, having said that, thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me. And of course, any questions, let them come and I'll try and do my best. With that, I hand back to our moderators.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. It was such enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. So, yeah, by presentation, then it has been raising questions like you have explained to us. There are many questions that should be answered, and I think it would be an interesting discussion, because I do believe from your interesting presentation, there would be many questions from the participants. So before moving on to the next section, which is Q&A section, so Professor, the participant asked for your copy of your presentation. Is it okay if we share your
by all means, yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, by all means, do share it with everyone. Everyone can have a full copy, and I mean, you have one, so you can share that with them, or otherwise I can send it again.
Sure, thank you, Professor.
Well, let me send it again, and I'll do it because I found 1 or 2 typos in it, and I corrected these this morning. So the one that I'm sharing is without the 2 typos. So I'll send it to you again, and you can share it.
All right. So everyone, so now we are moving to the next section, which is Q&A section. So for those who want to ask question, please just type your question on the chat box or directly turn on your microphone and ask the questions. So, right. Okay. Now we have 3 participants who would like to ask the question. So maybe I will go first to Miss Fadila Jamila.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Nelasari, for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Paul Torremans for the very insightful materials. I've read some literatures regarding the patent waiver, but the way you present it, it's very comprehensive, and we realize that it's not only about intellectual property, but it has also connection with competition law, and so on. My questions is actually related to your last questions that you even asked back. Are we prepared with the next pandemic? So my questions will be like, we know that the patent waiver, particularly concerning COVID, vaccine came for a reasons. So what do you think, out of all the possible solutions, what do you think is the fairest solution should this scenario repeated in the future or the next pandemic is come? The fairest way to still protect the patent holder, but does not put the humanity aside. Because as you said, it has been argued that the waiver would not guarantee to solve the problem. For example, because when we do the waiver, the quality of the vaccine COVID might reduce or would not be the same anymore. So the result might be different or could even harm the persons receiving it. So out of all the possible option out there, which one do you think is the fairest for both the patent holder and the people itself? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Ms. Fadila Jamila. So I think I will give the question to Professor Paul to directly answer that question. Please, Professor, your turn.
Thank you for that question. Well, as I said, I really don't know. I mean, as a lawyer, I would either like a system whereby there are clear conditions for the waiver to operate. But even then, I don't think that that's the complete answer. So I think we should find the political will and the political consensus to define what these exceptional circumstances are. I mean, now we had 2.5 years of discussion. If we're going to do that again next time, people are dying again and we're losing time again before we get to a situation where this is coming into effect. So we need clarity as to what are these exceptional circumstances, what are the thresholds, when do we, who makes that decision? Can we not leave it, for example, to the Director General of the WHO to declare that we are in a pandemic and therefore that the exceptional circumstances are met, or the two Director Generals together of the WTO and the WHO? But we need a mechanism. We can't have a political discussion between member states because that takes forever. Then it becomes really politics. We need also much clearer decisions as to how this process is going to work. We need faster procedures. If it's still going to take 2 years before the thing is up and running, then again, we lose valuable time. So I think that's one part. The waiver as a more structured, legally structured part of the analysis, at the same time about things like COVAX. What we need is a mechanism whereby, as it were, we need a plan that says we can distribute vaccines efficiently, quickly. We need a plan that says we have an agreement that if the industry gets the patents to encourage the research that may take place before the pandemic comes. We can develop new tools so that we can be quicker and more efficient in fine-tuning the new vaccine. We don't have to start from scratch again. Well, that can be protected by patents. There is no problem with that. Patents can play their role in that system. But what we then need is an undertaking in place that allows it to very quickly produce volume. Now, all these things needed to be negotiated. Production facilities needed to be booked, needed to be arranged, and there were bottlenecks in there. We need to have that ready. And then I think we need an undertaking from the industry that rather than member states donating surplus stock, that we have an undertaking that the industry will provide significant volumes to COVAX. That is ready. And we can have a deal that the member states, the WHO via the member states, will pay for that. But I think we need these things available. So I think you need 2 tracks, and we need them to be ready. And maybe, I mean, it's not my style of things, but I think in this respect, we need some kind of military regime. You know, we need a clear scenario that the army of the WHO can start marching as soon as there is a new pandemic, and that everyone is ready, that we have ammunition, that we have the tools available. And unfortunately, I see very little of that. I see maybe we need a bit of peace and quiet. We need this pandemic to go before the WHO can do more in this respect. And before, let's be honest, its member states allow the WHO to do more in this respect. It's a bit unfair also to say it's the WHO. The WHO can only march if the member states let it march and give it the funds to do so. So I'm hoping that I answered your question more or less.
All right. Thank you for your answer, Professor. So how's Miss Fadila Jamila? Are you happy with the answer, or do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'm very glad with the answer. Thank you very much, Mr. Paul. It's give me more insight. Thank you.
Okay, so we move on to the next participants who wants to ask the question. So please, Mr. Rifli Mubarak, time's yours.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, Professor Paul. I'm Rifli Mubarak, the third-year law student of Universitas Hasanuddin. So actually, it's such an honor and marvelous presentations related to the TRIPS agreement, and also the holistic presentation about the accessibility of patent itself. So my question was derived from the Indonesian regulation, states that Law number 13 of 2016 confirms that the government can implement its own patents based on considerations such as the state of emergency, which is also you have emphasized and stated before, such as the government use and also the compulsory licensing for the vaccine itself. And however, accessibility over exclusivity amidst the state of emergency, I think there should be there's a new possibility of problems that I found, such as the parallel importations. So where the parallel importation is more likely about how these traditional medicines, for instance, could be published inclusively to have the fair price of the medicines distribution. But I think how we could overcome those kind of possibilities if the biopiracy issues also come worldwide, if we still prioritize the accessibility and that people's safety is the highest law amidst the emergency condition. So I think amidst the dilemma, without permission and no free prior informed consent provisions from the patent holder amidst the emergency condition, I think amidst that dilemma, it's also we also need to think about how we could protect ourselves from being authentic as the patent holder amidst the biopiracy in terms of the context to make the medicines and also the patent itself should be accessible towards all. So I just would like to have those kind of responses towards these kind of biopiracy issues and also the parallel importation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Rifli Mubarak. So please, Professor Paul.
There's a lot of things in what you said. Let me try and highlight and answer a few of these points. Personally, I'm a great believer in parallel trade, but parallel trade that is well organized. Parallel trade means that the importation is done by companies that are under the control of the local health authorities. Like any other company making drugs in Indonesia, I would expect your Ministry of Health, I assume, to check any company being authorized to do parallel trade, to make sure that what is being imported is the original product in a good condition where the packaging has not been tampered with. There is no damage to, for example, blister packs, and therefore no potential risk to the tablets that are in there. I think on that basis, parallel trade can play a role. Pharmaceutical companies may think that a certain market is too small, not profitable enough. The fact that you can then import it from somewhere else, that may still be a way of making things available. Doesn't have to be in emergency circumstances. It's something that I think can play its role in providing access to certain pharmaceutical products and in providing safe access to pharmaceutical products. Biopiracy is quite another thing, and it's again, I think even in emergency situations, I think the authorities need to regulate and need to regulate carefully. So you need to have a regime that checks every medicine that's on the market. And again, that comes back to the point I made earlier. You need a plan. If you just declare a state of emergency and now we're going to start, I don't think you're going to have the time to do it properly. So you need these procedures in place. You need to have all these players on the market ready, but in a regulated market, on a market where they know their production facilities are being checked, meet certain standards and the like. So I think that's extremely important in this context. Final thing I would say is, of course, one has to be careful. If you look at, and it's part of the things where I would personally like a bit more flexibility, but if you look at Article 27 of the TRIPS agreement, the margin of maneuver for these states of emergency and special circumstances is very limited. The risk, therefore, is that if member states overdo it, they will be sued by private companies who are affected, but they may also be dragged in front of a WTO panel by the other member states. So again, there, I think that this is an area where within the WTO, one may want to negotiate in a bit more detail. What do we mean, for example, by these exceptional circumstances? You know, what is it? Also in terms of is public health really engaged? The more clarity, for now, it's a mechanism, and it's then left to the member states and controlled by the courts and eventually by a WTO panel. Well, that really demands that member states take a risk, suit, and eventually may lose or win. I think we should try and define these things with a bit of common sense and flexibility in advance. But again, we need the political will on all sides. And I think if the process of the waiver has shown us something, that is that the political will is not always present. I mean, if you read all the reports, I was not there, so I'm not accusing anyone. But the United Kingdom and Switzerland are being singled out by quite a number of parties as consistently trying to block things and put, as it were, the knife in everyone's back. Well, as long as that is happening, we're not going to make a lot of progress. Again, I hope that more or less answers your concerns.
All right. How about Mr. Rifli Mubarak? Do you have further question, or are you happy with the answer?
Thank you. It already answers my concerns. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Next, we move on to the next participant. So please, Ms. Nurul Muhaib, to ask your questions.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a student in International Law Department, and I'm very grateful to have this very insightful and thought-provoking lecture by Prof. Paul. So my question is, well, given the fact that the waiver is approved on June 2022, which is actually related to your last question, a little or a little late, where many developing countries, including 80% of Indonesian citizens, have been actually got first dose, and 70% of them actually had their second dose. My question is, what will be the very least, actually, the impact or contribution upon this waiver itself? Or could this be only a monumental action for preparing in certain other circumstances which a more comprehensive regulatory tool on waiver mechanism by the WTO is needed?
Okay, thank you. Please, Professor Paul.
Well, again, I think the honest answer is I don't know. I wish I knew. My guess, well, let me try to guess. My guess is that in the current circumstances, there will be very limited use of the waiver in this case. I don't think we still have a massive need to produce vast volumes. I mean, if we have a new variant of COVID, I mean, let's hope not, huh? But if it all starts again, we need a modified vaccine, this might still play a role. I think I agree with you that it's probably more of opening a door, saying, look, if something happens, we have this tool, we have now shown that it can be used. People may be reluctant to apply for it again. And therefore, I hope that what we achieve at least is that we have more detailed procedures in the near future, that the fact that it's now relatively quiet, June and then the summer came and the comments stopped. Maybe that means that behind closed doors, well, closed doors, I mean, doors that are not necessarily in the newspapers and on the television, right? I mean, shouting at each other in the press doesn't help. So maybe further negotiations can take place, and maybe some HIV/AIDS. As soon as the Rwanda deal after the Doha Declaration came into place, the industry started to say, well, we can do something, we can help. Maybe here as well, the large manufacturers of vaccines may be more willing to say, well, maybe now we can start signing up potential partners, and when the next one comes, we can have these voluntary licenses in place, and then maybe also at political level, we can negotiate more strict procedures. The one thing, of course, that makes me say this with even more caution, in recent weeks, Moderna has been suing Pfizer for, I think, patent infringement, or I think, yeah, it was, I think, an infringement of their patents. Yeah, that doesn't help, of course. If the two big guys, rather than work together on a better deal for the next one, are suing each other, once you're in court, that takes all the energy, and that may delay things even further. So I agree with you. We may need further procedures. They may come from the private industry. They may come at WHO level. And then the WTO and the WHO can sit together and see how what is agreed at one level can fit in under the waiver proceedings at the other level, how that can be, these exceptional circumstances and so forth can be defined more precisely. Yeah, don't count on it next month. Next year, it will take a bit longer.
Yeah, how about Ms. Nurul? Do you have further questions?
I think I have no further question. Thank you for the answers and the insights.
Thank you very much. Is there any question from the audience? We still have time. So, well, okay, Professor, maybe while waiting for the other participants to ask their questions, I'm really excited to hear your presentation. And yeah, as you explained about exceptional circumstance, you mentioned about exceptional circumstance. So I'm curious, what do you think about this pandemic? Does it count as a exceptional circumstance in your viewpoint? And you said that there is no definition relating to exceptional circumstance. So do you think how should exceptional circumstance be defined?
I think that's a delicate question. It's a delicate question for a very simple reason. You and I tend to think of exceptional circumstances, shall I say by way of abbreviation, in a WHO context rather than in a WTO context. What I mean is, you asked me whether the pandemic was an exceptional circumstance. Well, in the legal framework that we have, in the Marrakesh Agreement, that is the wrong question. Right? I mean, for the WHO, of course, this is an exceptional circumstance. In terms of health, this is something that we have rarely seen before. If this is not an exceptional circumstance, then probably nothing will ever be an exceptional circumstance. So in terms of health, yes, it is. The problem is, that's not the question. Under the Marrakesh Agreement, you need exceptional circumstances in relation to any of the obligations in the TRIPS agreement, in our case, or in any other part of the WTO agreement. But you need to show that the patent system, as designed, so broad patents with certain limitations, these are exceptional circumstances in the sense that that mechanism does not work or does not work well enough. So you need to show that the idea of having a patent, make sure that not enough medicine is produced, not enough vaccines are developed, not enough vaccines are made available, and that a compulsory license with all the things that come with it, the whole mechanism in Article 31 and 31 bis, cannot solve it. That is an exceptional circumstances from a WTO point of view, right? There are exceptional circumstances that mean that the obligations don't work and the obligations stand in the way. So I think the problem is that we need coordination between these two. We need an argument, we need a definition. When is it the case that the pandemic is such that the mechanisms of patent law are not sufficient to produce reply? And I think that's a delicate question, because the pharmaceutical industry will say the mechanisms are needed. If we have no patent, we will not be able to secure the funding for the research that will lead to the vaccine. So without the patent, no vaccine. And no vaccine means there's nothing you can do, right? So we need a more delicate mechanism that says, look, at some stage, you need to be able to distribute at a certain volume. And therefore, I think that's why I say you need these plans in advance. We need a plan from the industry that says how we can ramp up and how many partners do we need? And do we have these people? Do we have these agreements to say that your facilities can be used and how we can do this in practice? And I think then you can put a threshold in there that says, well, if these plans are not sufficient, then you move to a waiver and then you invite everyone else. So it seems to me you need a plan first to respond to the health emergency via the patent system, and a plan that shows how flexible the industry can be, how much use we can make of the patent system and the voluntary license deal, eventually with 1 or 2 compulsory licenses if need be, and how we can do that quickly. And then you can say, if the WTO and the WHO agree that that is not enough, for example, we need 1 billion and we can produce 500 million under the plan, then you have the exceptional circumstances, and then you can waive the patent and say, anyone who's capable of doing it, please come and help. I think that would make sense. And then you have a workable definition. But getting the political will to do that, I wish all the diplomats a lot of good luck. Or they will spend the rest of their career and they will have a job for life trying to negotiate this. But I don't think we have the life of the diplomats to get there. I think we need to get there earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for your explanation. So everyone, is there any question from the audience?
Just to remind, I think we already have enough time. It's already 5 p.m. here.
All right, so Professor, the time has come. So I think it was such a insightful presentation and also interesting discussion from Professor Paul and all the participants. So once again, I would like to thank to Professor Paul Torremans for your time, for serving your time. We know that you have a lot of activities, a hectic schedule, but you still you are still being here with us to share knowledge and also discuss these interesting and ongoing issues. So everyone, I think that's all about the guest lecture today. Thank you very much for your participation and attention. So I hand this over to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Nila Sariasha. That was the end of our guest lecture and discussion sessions of the TRIPS waiver for vaccine patents. And now we're moving to the next agenda, that is the giving of appreciation certificate for our guest speaker awarded by the Dean of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University. Okay, let me share the first certificate of appreciation is given to the first certificate is given to Professor Dr. Paul Torremans as our guest lecturer for today's event. And the second certificate is given to our moderator, Ms. Nila Sariasha. All right. Okay, before we end our agenda, I'd like to ask for all the Zoom participants to have your camera open so I can take the screenshots of all of us together. Let me count to 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. All right. Okay, thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This is the end of our guest lecture event today. We would like to thank our guest speaker, Professor Dr. Paul Torremans, for the insightful lecture. And also thank you for all the participants who have joined us virtually today. And on behalf of the committee, I do apologize for all the inconvenience during the webinar. Stay safe and see you in the next occasion. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon for the UK. From Indonesia. Thank you, everyone. You may leave the Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Nila.